going to be Mum and Dad Dorsall, but for the next year or so, before being replaced by Sergeant Frimston. I couldn't remember his name, but he did. By the way, did you know that Sergeant Nobby Hall was only ever an acting sergeant? Because he couldn't pass his RF education test part. Again, he knew that. I didn't.
I got it from Ozzy Osbourne, who actually met Nobby Hall on one of his postings when Nobby invited him to the Corporals Club, which rather surprised Ozzy because he thought Nobby was a sergeant, and that's when it all came out, the fact he couldn't pass the education test.
Well, Nobby Hall, who never went anywhere without his bike, which only had one pedal. Do you remember?
Yep.
Only had one pedal. I still have visions of him riding hell for leather round the corner from the sergeant's mess, late as usual for morning parade, outside Gibson Block. And more often than not, standing in front of D-Flight with stinking beer breath, red eyes, foaming white mouth, which we found out later were the remnants of milk and magnesia tablets, and Rennies he'd taken to soothe his heartburn from drinking too much the night before in the sergeant's mess. He never liked me very much. And this is a personal story. He never liked me very much. And told me repeatedly throughout my 18 months at Hereford, McNulty, you'll be lucky to pass out from training, let alone do anything else. And to a 16-year-old, that was pretty hard to take. I think it might have been the fact that at that age I was quite wary and suspicious of adults, so I never really engaged with him, or I'd never pander to his jokes or tomfoolery like others who were clearly more comfortable around him than I was. But then I looked at who J-Flight had as their senior NCOSC. Sergeant Les Payne, smart, upright, military, and exactly the opposite of Nobby Hall, who looked more like a railway porter than a sergeant in the Royal Air Force. Even at that tender age, I was quite embarrassed for him, and I knew I could never really respect him. While I thought, have J-Flight got Sergeant Payne, who was always smart, tough but fair, and we've got this guy who would look more at home collecting tickets at King's Cross railway station. Just my personal opinion, and it's not everybody's, I know. I digress. Anyway, boys, said Nobby, this will be your home for the foreseeable future and until such time as we can find you suitable accommodation in a nice brick building with central heating and hot running water like the other boys are lucky to have in Gibson Block. But don't be despondent, because the reason you've been chosen, yes, chosen to bunk here, is because you are the best looking, the hardest, the fittest and the meanest boys amongst the rest of the scrawny urchins who arrived with you today.
I don't know where the hell I was picked.
and so we all know that you will set them an example of how a boy entrant should act and behave, and without complaint. Don't be despondent and don't complain, he said, as I found myself allocated a bed space next to two of the foreign I was talking about earlier, two Scots in beds next to me, talking in a foreign language that only Spock from Star Trek will understand, and not understanding a bloody word they said. See how quiet he is? He's not saying a word. And they know who they are. Well, I was going to say they're both here, but Stu McNaughton's had to rush away home, and Stu was the 5th Stormtrooper who would have been here. And when I talk about bed space, girls, this was a 2-foot area around your bed.
Good hold hands. That's good.
That was exclusive to you. And bear in mind, there were 17, 18 of us in this dorm. There was exclusive to you and a no-go area to anyone else except by personal invitation. And God help anybody who you invited to actually sit on your bed, but then took the liberty of lifting both their feet off the floor and laying down on your bed. You get my drift. No way. Anyway, from that day on, we were told by Sergeant Nobby Hall that because of our situation and self-sacrifice for the rest of D-Flight, we would be known as the Stormtroopers. True. This was a true story. Not anybody's Stormtroopers, but you understand, but Sergeant Nobby Hall Stormtroopers. And that is the absolute truth of how we got to be named. Wow, we were so impressed, really. But with hindsight, so bloody gullible and naive. Other members of D Flight might remember or not that the Stormtroopers rarely mix with the rest of the flight. Not out of dislike for each other, you understand, it was just the way it was. We never even had drill practice with the rest of the guys until we got nearer to pass out. Nobby Hall used to take us for drill, just the Stormtrooper. I don't know whether you remember, I don't know who the rest of you had in D Flight. His Stormtroopers. Anyway, a few months went by, 3 or 4 I think, and the 18 of us were eventually moved into one of the rooms in Campbell Block, which as it happened was right next door to Gibson Block where the rest of the D&J flights were, with exactly the same layout, 2 dorms on the bottom, 2 on the first floor. So we still weren't accommodated with J or D flight in the 51st. No, we moved in with the 49th entry, who joined the RAF some months before us, because there was a spare room or dormitory in their block, so they moved us into there. But I remember thinking, why are we still being treated differently? Why are we still not accommodated with the rest of D&J flights? And why do I still feel like I'm not part of D Flight? And I didn't, personally I didn't. I just felt a little bit odd, but then I was odd. The truth of the matter was that there were so many of us, as Simon said, who joined up in the 51st entry that they couldn't fit us all into one block. That's the bottom line. But you have to remember, well, we were 15 and 16-year-olds and very susceptible and influenced by what was said and done to us and what we subsequently thought and believed. So I grew up fast in those 18 months. I really did. Anyway, like I said, we eventually moved into Campbell Block, which, oh my God, also had indoor toilets. We changed to flush the loos instead of bits of wire or string, and with whole panes of glass in the window frame. It also had constant hot running water that never ran out if you were the last one in, which often happened in 183. If you were late getting out of bed, you had a cold shower.
Just come in, Terry?
Yes, surely. Sure.
When we were in Hut 183, we didn't have any urinals because Hut 183 was in the old WAF lines. so everything was a sit down.
So not only were we in a hut, we were in a bloody woman's hut.
That's nothing.
What a life.
Yeah. Anyway, and we had central heating as well that didn't require shoveling coke into a burner. We had to keep those coke burners alive, but I'll say a bit more about that in a minute. But do you know what? I really missed Hut 183. I really did. And the camaraderie we found there, which continued right throughout our 18 months of training, with an all for one and one for all attitude and mentality. Do you know, after our initial move to Malcolm Block, I used to wake up in the middle of the night thinking I was still in Hut 183 and wondering if the coke burners had gone out. True. And as a result of the coke burners running out, were we all going to freeze to death? But thankfully that didn't last long. And did the coke burners go out in Hut 183? Oh yes, they did. What we used to do was stoke them up last thing at night, and when we did, they literally glowed red. Literally, with the heat, used to glow red. And if you slept near one, you'd be lovely and warm and get your feet toasted, but if you slept further away from them, you still froze. And yes, occasionally, like I said, they did go out and we would wake up freezing. Imagine today, that would be a child safeguarding issue, wouldn't it? Yeah, it would. We were 15 and 16-year-old, you know, minors. Again, you have to remember, we were 15, 16 years old. But we soon adjusted to our new surroundings in Malcolm Block and finally got through the cold turkey of our move because after all, we were the best looking, the hardest, the fittest, and the meanest boys in the whole entry. Seriously though, I'll tell this story because I'm not sure that the rest of the entry, as I said earlier, really appreciated what we went through and yeah, and what we put up with in those early months of our time in Hut 183. But it's like Ray Wilkinson said to me not so long ago, we were all cocooned in our own little groups, and because of this, the Stormtroopers, as I said earlier, they're rarely mixed with the rest of the entry on a day-to-day basis. Not, as I said before, out of any dislike of anyone, but we didn't really know them. So there it is. Although I've embellished this story just a little bit, and used some poetic license, it is essentially a true story of how we lived as Stormtroopers in Hut 183. And what is perfectly true and somewhat ironic is that soon after our move to Campbell Block, I contracted bronchial pneumonia. So what was that all about? So I'm moving from a hut where we were freezing to death to, I was in sick quarters for a week and then went off on 2 weeks sick leave before returning to try and catch up with my training. Anyway, if any of you want to be bored some more, I'm sure we can pull up a couple of sandbags, swing a few lights, and we can tell you a bit more about what life was as a stormtrooper. Like Mitch bringing back a haggis from his leave in Scotland, and for all of us cooking it in one of those red fire buckets on one of the coke burners, only for the bucket to boil over and for the haggis to explode. It's funny now though, because whenever I prick the sausages at home, I always think of that one.
Have you ever had a rhinoceros fart underwater?
Oh,
That's
yeah.
what happened when the haggis went off.
And I think we just had a ball night. We were having an inspection the next morning, and we were up until about 3 o'clock in the morning just trying to clear the bloody mess up. Anyway, that's my story of how the Stormtroopers came to light, and and remember, if you don't recognise the Stormtroopers, just look around, and there's 4 of us here. For the best looking, the hardest, the fittest, and the meanest amongst us. And I'd just like to say an RIP to fellow Stormtroopers, Jim Laurie and Phil Linley. And they both used to sleep opposite me. And we think Jimmy King maybe, but we're not sure about Jimmy. There's no concrete evidence, but nobody's ever said anything more about him. And remember earlier in my piece, Sergeant Nobby Hall saying to me that I'd be lucky to even pass out from the RAF at Hereford. Well, for the record, I served for 37 years in the Royal Air Force, and I was a warrant officer for 14 of those years. And my claim to fame, and I'm really proud of this, is that I left RAF Hereford in July '65 as an ex-boy entrant, and returned in 1993 as a warrant officer in charge of the school that had trained me 28 years previously. So, Corporal Acting Sergeant Nobby Hall, if you're listening up there, up yours, mate.